Joining me in our Washington studios is Dhruva Jaishankar. He is the Executive Director of the Observer Research Foundation here in the US. Dhruv, welcome to WION.
Thank you.
Prime Minister Modi has begun his engagements. 8 meetings today, a lot that is lined up. What do you think should be the key takeaway that we expect from this?
Well, I think there are two aspects to his visit this time. One is obviously a bilateral visit. The US relationship remains an important one for India. I believe today he's been meeting primarily with CEOs, and it shows in some ways the importance of the economic and the private sector relationship, of the involvement of major American companies and the continued interest of major American companies in India. So that I think is one aspect of it. There will obviously be the bilateral meeting with President Biden tomorrow. The second aspect, of course, is the Quad, which is the first in-person meeting of the four heads of government of the Quad countries. So I think that the strategic significance of that, and the fact that they are meeting for the first time, this is only the second trip abroad, I believe, that Prime Minister Modi has made since the pandemic started. So those, I think, are the two great aspects of significance of this visit.
Regarding the Quad, India has been called the weak link of the Quad, and it's been 14 years or more. They talked about the quadrilateral alliance, but it did not really go very far. Do you think that this first in-person summit is going to define the shape and the scope of the Quad? Will they formalize it?
Well, in some ways it is formalized already. I think it's not an, it's in some ways a loose coalition, so it does not have a secretariat. They have created 3 working groups, which was created during the first virtual summit that was held earlier this year in March, on vaccines, on critical and emerging technologies, and on climate change. But I think that narrative of India being the weak link, I think, was perpetuated by certain people in the US, and particularly, I think, sometimes with ulterior motive. But what I think that does speak to is the fact that India, unlike the other 2 members of the Quad, apart from the US, India is not a US ally, and I think does not have the history that Japan and Australia have in terms of security cooperation, many decades of security cooperation with the United States. So obviously involving India in something like this has taken more time. It has required increasing the comfort levels of all 4 countries with each other. And what we've seen over the last 15 years or so actually has been, I think the big story has been the growing relationships, not just of the 4 countries, but amongst the 4 countries. So, India-Australia relations are arguably the best they've ever been. India-Japan relations have gone from strength to strength. So that, I think, is the real story, and it makes sense for these 4 countries that have very similar worldviews, are all Indo-Pacific countries, to be working together in a coalition such as this.
We've seen China's reactions to the Quad, from sea foam to calling it a threat and a challenge and a destabilizing force. And China is the elephant in the room. Yet when we speak to Quad member nations and their leaders, or we hear from them, they say that this is an alliance for something and not against someone. How do you deal with a challenge that you will not even spell out?
Well, look, I think this is quite normal. Every country says something in public and does something else. China is not alone in that. China itself does a lot of that. The public rationale for the Belt and Road Initiative is very different from what most analysts would say is the real reason behind some of China's foreign investments. So I think it's only natural that publicly they give a different line. President Joe Biden himself said that it's not about China. But I think there's another element to it as well, which is, one, it is genuinely about creating a positive vision for the region and not simply being reactive. And secondly, I think it is also to assuage some serious concerns of other parties, including in Southeast Asia, amongst other places, that this is not going to be about narrowing the choices for them. It's actually about expanding their choices and giving them, say, whether it's infrastructure financing, whether it's vaccines, whether it is supply chains, giving them another option apart from China in many cases. So in that sense, I think it makes sense to present a positive vision of the Quad rather than defining it in opposition to another actor.
So this is going to compete with the BRI, are you saying, or China-centered supply chains?
Oh, look, I think we are in a period where the US and China are the 2 largest economies in the world. They are very integrated economies, and I think that has led to this tension. Now the question is, we're seeing a slow decoupling of the two economies, driven largely by political and security concerns, particularly in the technology space, but in any kind of critical components. There is a growing realization both in China and the US that they cannot depend on supply chains in the other country and amongst the others allies. So we're seeing this slow decoupling taking place. And it is in this context, I think, where the question really comes out about trust. About political trust. It's, you trade with countries with whom you're willing to have a certain kind of relationship with, and you trust them to have that relationship, and that trust requires transparency. So I think that logical train means that there are, obviously, while it makes sense for India to be manufacturing certain critical components at home, but when it does come to partnerships, who do you actually partner with? And when it comes to 5G technology, when it comes to semiconductors, when it comes to pharmaceutical supplies, these are all critical components. So in that sense, I think we are having an organic shift taking place as part of this larger decoupling that will take years, perhaps even decades to materialize.
Until, say, 2 months back, all the talk was about how Joe Biden will be tough on China and what he intends to do. And then suddenly we have this withdrawal from Afghanistan. And we're talking about China filling that power vacuum, and we're talking about how America botched it up. Do you think that this has shifted the narrative completely at a time when, there was a time when he ordered that investigation into the origins of the Wuhan virus that did not yield very much. Mm-hmm. All the focus has shifted from what we should be doing vis-a-vis China to how America may not be a reliable partner. France is upset with them. Mm-hmm. How do you approach a strategic partner that is seen as unreliable by its traditional allies?
No, I mean, I think every, I think it's more complicated than that. I mean, the UK and Australia have doubled down on their relationship with the US. In some ways, Japan and India have intensified their relationship in very different ways with the US. But I think, ultimately in international relations, beyond a point, nobody trusts anybody else, right? This is the state of international relations. Even close allies always have, separate, there's a reason they all have separate intelligence agencies, separate command structures in their militaries and so forth. They're responsive to different audiences, their own electorates. So I think beyond a point that will happen. The question on Afghanistan, I think it will take time to see how that plays out. I think it'll only be more evident in hindsight as to how the withdrawal, and I think no one questions that it was a botched withdrawal by the US, how that withdrawal will have affected US-China competition. Proponents say, including I suspect several people in the US administration, that pulling out of Afghanistan actually frees the US up to take on great power challengers, including China. That it's about ending those what they see as unnecessary wars. It's about devoting more resources to great power competition. Others have argued, and sometimes quite convincingly, that the signal that sends has second-order effects. It has created a vacuum. It has eroded trust in the U.S. It has eroded a sense of competence in the U.S. Even if the decision to pull out was a good one, the way it was done was badly handled. So I think it is only we'll see in time whether, in the long run, whether that decision will actually have helped the U.S. over the long run. By freeing it of other commitments, or whether it will actually hurt it reputationally and otherwise.
Is India going to seek specific assurances on Afghanistan? Because for India it remains very much a threat, while Americans may have moved on from the issue and it's not their problem anymore. What's happening in and around Kabul has a direct bearing on security in
Absolutely,
India.
Yes. No, I mean, assurances about what? Beyond, now that the US have withdrawn, it has much less leverage there. And so, beyond a point now, the US...
They're working with the Pakistanis.
Let me just put it this way. I don't think US-Pakistan relations are in the greatest health. In fact, I think there's been a very significant change over the last 10, 15 years in how the US government, successive US governments have approached Pakistan. US aid to Pakistan has trickled down to very negligible amounts from a very high amount 10 to 15 years ago, including military assistance. Imran Khan complains that Joe Biden has still not given him a call. There hasn't yet been that level of, the fact that Pakistan could not have been trusted to help with the evacuation from Afghanistan is quite significant. I mean, this is supposedly an ally, 200 kilometers from Kabul, and yet Pakistan did not lift a finger to help the US at this time. So I think that that is well understood. The US now, having withdrawn, has limited military leverage in Afghanistan today. There are a number of issues, though. I think it is the question really is about what to do with the Taliban government. There are questions about its future. Will it remain resilient? Running an insurgency is very different from governing a country, particularly a complex country that is very divided, such as Afghanistan. And so I think you have seen, amongst other things, coordination between the US and India at the United Nations in terms of setting benchmarks for what the Taliban needs to do to get certain things, such as restrictions, assistance for the Afghan people, a lifting of travel restrictions on Taliban leaders. So those are some of the areas where the US and India are coordinating, sometimes see eye to eye, in other cases do not see eye to eye, and there have been differences. So I think that remains to be seen. India is also, of course, for Afghanistan looking at other partners, Iran being one of them, the Gulf states being another, Russia and Central Asian states. So I don't think this idea that the US and India are the only two, India needs to look to the US to help it in Afghanistan. India is on its own, and there are many areas where the US can work with India and has been working with India, but there are other areas obviously where the US and India don't see eye to eye.
Vaccines may be one of them. They are going to be talking about COVID response, and there is a concern in India that the rules in India's democratic allies that they have come up with on vaccines are very arbitrary. We saw what happened with the UK, mm-hmm. and even with the US, there is a compulsory quarantine once you come here. Mm-hmm. Will there be more clarity post these conversations, or is that something that we don't want to upset our allies with?
Vaccines, if you look at every readout of every meeting, high-level meeting between the US and India, COVID and vaccines has been at the top of the agenda. So this has been an ongoing discussion, not just with the US, but with other partners and allies. They have their own domestic constituencies and domestic requirements to meet. Different countries have taken different views in terms of how open or closed to be when it comes to vaccines, what vaccines to recognize. So this is certainly coming up. It's not about upsetting any countries. I think it's quite clear what India would desire, what the US desires. Sometimes, again, there's alignment. Other cases, there's not been alignment. Even the European Union and the US have had very sharp differences on this issue. So I think that will come up. The question is, how do we move? I think two aspects to this. One is working on vaccine development, and that had been a major point of difference between the US and India a few months back, particularly when India was hit by the second wave, where there were serious concerns that the US was not facilitating supplies of raw materials to India for vaccines and for other COVID-related materials needed to combat COVID. Some of those hurdles were overcome, and the US did actually adjust its plans for its global vaccine rollout because of the situation in India, in fact. Another element of that is there's actually a Quad initiative when it comes to vaccines. So they will be manufacturing in, I believe, Hyderabad of J&J vaccines meant primarily for exports, but the idea is to provide reasonable, cheap vaccines for the Indian market, for third countries. So that is underway, and I think a progress report will be something that we'll see perhaps this week. The hope is that 1 billion vaccines will come online next year. So that's one area of cooperation. The other is travel restrictions and recognition about vaccine certificates. I think the case needs to be made that India has QR code, has a recording of vaccinations. Many people have AstraZeneca vaccine that is recognized in the US. So I do think that case can be made persuasively that India, should be, the travel restrictions should over time be diluted for India. Ultimately, it's in the US's best interest. A lot of Indian students are coming to the US, business people, tourists, and so it makes sense from their point of view to make it easier for Indians to travel to the US over time.
Right. Final question. As Prime Minister Modi heads to New York for the UNGA, one of the things that India has been underlining is the need for reform. Do you see any progress on that front?
This is my personal view. I'm very personally skeptical of UN reform. I think in any case where you have pretty large-scale reform, any case where you have, in this instance, 5 parties, the P5, who are very invested in retaining a veto, it makes it very hard for them to want to dilute that power over time. We did see a G4 meeting of the 4 other countries, India, Japan, Germany and Brazil, who are, have been advocating for the reform and for a place for themselves in the UN Security Council, a permanent place for themselves. But I'm very skeptical that that will happen in the near future. That being said, I don't think India can afford to drop the ball. It will have to continue to advocate on its own behalf when it comes to multilateral reform in general.
Indeed, we'll see how that goes. Thanks very much, Dhruv, for sharing your perspective with us.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.